Good morning, friends, and thank you all for being here. Welcome to Westwood Presbyterian Church. We're so happy that you're with us. If you're new, I think many of you are here, not your first time, but my name is Stevich, and I serve as WPC's Director of Faith Formation and Creation Care. And part of my calling in this community is helping us ask what it means to live faithfully and gratefully within God's creation. And gatherings like this are one of the reasons I really love that work. This faith conversation is part of our creation season here at WPC, a season when we intentionally turn our attention to the living world God has made and entrusted to our care. It is a season for wonder, for honesty, and for hope. And there's perhaps no better voice to launch our creation season than our guest this morning, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist, the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and a distinguished professor and chair at Texas Tech University. In her role at the Nature Conservancy, she helps lead a global community of more than 1,000 scientists and staff working on solutions to the intertwined crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. She has also served as an author for multiple U.S. national climate assessments. She has been recognized as one of Time's 100 most influential people and as a United Nations champion of the earth. And she is widely known for making complex science clear, accessible, and deeply connected to the values that move people to action. And that gift is on really remarkable display in her best-selling book, Saving Us, which I'm sure some of you have read. But what makes Dr. Hayhoe especially right for this room on this morning is that she speaks not only as a scientist, but as a Christian. Her faith and her science are not in tension. They belong to the same calling. She has spent years helping communities of faith see that creation care is not separate from discipleship, but bound up with the love of neighbor, with moral clarity and hope. And so we couldn't ask for a more fitting voice to lead and inspire us today. So friends, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
It is such a pleasure to be able to be with you virtually, and I can actually see a few of you there because the camera's giving me a couple of different options. So I'm not only going to be speaking to you, you're also going to be speaking to me, and I'll show you how you're going to do that. Let me just share my screen for a minute. So if you go ahead and take out your phone and take a picture of this QR code with your phone, and you'll see a little yellow bar pop up, and if you click on that bar, it will take you to polev.com where you can put in your questions at any time. I will remind you of this as we go through. So as I'm speaking, if you have a question, you think, oh, I wish I could, ask her about this, you can put your question in any time. And this is the even better part. You can upvote other people's questions. So when I get to the end, I will be able to answer the most upvoted questions based on what you want to hear from the most. So I will remind you of this a couple of times, and as we go through at the end, you will see this. But when we get to the end, you will see, and on your phones, you can see the questions that have been upvoted as well as the questions that haven't. But when we get to the end, it will look like, let me just show you here. You will see this, and you will see the questions that have been most upvoted. So let me give you that QR code one more time, just in case you didn't get it. I know sometimes it takes a minute or two. And if you want to, if the QR code isn't working and you have to type it in, you can do that too. Just make sure when you type it in, it's polev.com/Katharine, and you have to spell it with 2 A's. Often when people type it in, your phone auto corrects to Katherine, and that won't work. It has to be A. So I'm going to test it myself with my phone just to make sure that we've got there. And you should have something that looks like this, if you can see that. All right. So let me get started. I am a scientist, and so what I do is I study what's happening and how it affects us. But these days, you don't have to be a scientist to see what's happening all around us. When I ask people how they feel about this issue, 95% of the people I speak with are worried or concerned, paralyzed, anxious, depressed, angry even over this issue. And we see these numbers not quite as high, but we see them across much of the US, which might surprise you. We often think people don't care, but many people do care. So if you feel this way, if you feel concerned about this issue, if you feel anxious, if you feel worried, if you feel frustrated, there's four things that you need to know. And the first one, I think, is the most important one, and one that speaks very, very strongly to us as Christians, as members of the church, is that if we are worried about this issue of climate change, we're not alone. And I think that's a really important message because we know that we are not built to function alone. The image that is used for the church is that of a body. And we know that individual body parts don't work alone. And so in the same way, often, too often, when people are worried about an issue like climate change, they think that they are alone. And if they are alone, they're not able to do anything about it. So often we think that those of us here, you sitting there, me, obviously, and maybe some of the people we know, we're worried. But most other people, we think, are not worried. Why? Because they don't want to talk about it. The reality, though, if we look at the data, is that most people are worried. In the United States, it's over 2/3 of people in the country are worried. In other countries like Canada and the EU and the UK and other countries like that, it's over 80% of people are worried. But in the US, only 8% are activated. And so often we assume that people aren't worried. And so we think, well, we just have to make them more worried. But worry isn't enough. We could be worried, and if we don't know what to do, we'll do nothing. And that's where most people are today. So if you look at California, for example, you can see that, are you worried? These are older numbers. We're now in 2026, so we're up over 2/3. But you can see that anywhere that's yellow or orange is more than 50%. And you can see that most people are, in fact, worried. In fact, the majority in almost every state are already worried. And this was 2 years ago. If we look around the world, here, any country that's pink is more than 60% of people are worried. And the gray areas weren't surveyed. You can see that many places are well over 80%. And again, these numbers are actually from 2 years ago as well. So if we're worried, we're not alone. In fact, we are the majority of people. And that's something that's really important to know. But there's a second thing we need to know, and that if we're worried about this, it means that we actually understand what's happening. Worry about what is happening to our shared home is a rational response to what's going on. It's not being too sensitive. It's not being, worried about something that doesn't matter. No, it's actually a rational response to what's happening. So what is happening? Well, in a nutshell, our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keeps us at the perfect temperature for life. The sun's energy shines down and it goes through this blanket like a window. The earth absorbs the sun's energy and heats up. And this natural blanket our planet has traps just enough heat inside the climate system to keep us the perfect temperature for life. If we didn't have this natural blanket, we'd be a frozen ball of ice. So if that's the case, then what's the problem? Well, the problem is that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, that's 2/3 of the issue. And then by cutting down trees and by large-scale industrial agriculture and waste, that's the other third of the issue. We are producing so many more heat-trapping gases that we're actually wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that we never needed. And just like you would if someone snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you, you'd wake up sweating saying, hey, I didn't need this extra blanket. In the same way, our Earth is running a fever. And if that was the only thing that was happening, it would just be, sort of like a scientific curiosity that scientists study. But as you know, when your body's running a fever, you don't feel well, right? You feel achy, you feel sore, you might have a headache. You're taking medicine to feel better. You're going to the doctor to find out what's wrong. In the same way, as our Earth is running a fever, we're feeling the impacts. Now, like I said, this extra blanket began primarily when we started to use massive amounts of coal, gas, and oil to power our industrial system. And as a result, we're conducting a truly unprecedented experiment with the only planet we have. We have never seen this much heat trapping gases going into the atmosphere this quickly. The Earth has been hotter before and it's been cooler before, but the rate of change is unprecedented. And we can see that when we look at the data. I promise you there won't be too many scientific charts. This is one of, I think, only two. What you're looking at here is you're looking at temperature over the last 2,000 years. And what you can see is how it goes up and down from year to year. And over time, the Earth's temperature varies as much as that of our human body does over the course of a day. Your body temperature goes up and down by a few tenths of a degree over the course of a day. And that's normal and that's natural. But we are now running the equivalent of a 2-degree Fahrenheit fever. And if your body's running a 2-degree Fahrenheit fever, you don't feel well, right? You're taking some Tylenol, you're wondering who coughed on you or what you ate, you're calling the doctor. That's where we are today. Now, this is why people often refer to this issue as global warming, because the average temperature of the planet is increasing thanks to this extra blanket we're wrapping around it. But what I often call it is global weirding. Because wherever you live, the weather's getting weirder, right? I mean, think about it yourself. Have you noticed the weather getting weirder where you live? About 10 years ago, I was standing in line to pick up my son from Sunday school after church. And the man in front of me said, I have a question. Do you mind if I ask you a question? I was like, well, we're just sitting here waiting. Sure. And he said, do you feel like the weather has gotten weirder? And I thought about it. I thought, well, I live in Texas, where our heavy rainfall has gotten more intense. Our summers are getting hotter. Our hurricanes are getting stronger. Our droughts are more severe. We've even had some of the biggest wildfires we've ever had on record in Texas. Now, granted, those aren't what you have in California, but it's still pretty bad. And so I said, yeah, I do think it's gotten weirder. And he said, I knew it. He said, I've been living here for 30 years and I could tell that something was different. So since then, I've asked hundreds of people, not do you believe in global warming? First of all, because it isn't a belief system, it's not a religion, it's just what's happening, what thermometers tell us. But also, climate change and global warming has become so politically polarized that a lot of people don't want to use those words or admit that they agree. So I don't ask people, do you believe in global warming? I say, has the weather gotten weirder? Do you feel like the weather's gotten weirder? And then I just sit back. Everybody has something to say about that. And often after they've told me, not me telling them telling me, after they've told me how much weirder it's gotten, then I can say, yes, that sounds terrible. And I ask how it affected them and their family and their home and people and things and places they care about. And then I can say, you know, that's actually happening in other places across the US. And I can give some examples, and it's even happening around the world. And this is exactly why people are worried about it and why we need to do something about it. And then it's not like you're telling somebody that there's a problem they don't agree with. They've already told you all about the problem. And then you can talk about solutions. But let me go on a little bit and explain what I mean more by global weirding. So wherever you live, it's as if we have this pair of weather dice. And we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. Like what? Like a heat wave, a drought, a storm, a wildfire, a hurricane, or more. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's like it's sneaking in and it's taking one of these numbers and turning it into a 6, and then another number and turning it into a 6, and then even a 7 sometimes on the dice. Like here in Texas, for example, we've actually had in Houston, they had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. And you're like, how could that happen? It's because climate change is loading the weather dice against us. So like I said, we've always had heat waves, but our heat waves are getting stronger and we're having more of them. We've always had droughts, but oh my gosh, this last winter, the impact of the snow drought on water supply across the entire West, we're just beginning to reckon with that. And then the wildfires, you know all about that. Wildfires are getting bigger and they're burning more area. Now, yes, the majority of wildfires, especially in California, are due to accidental human ignition. I think about 7% are arson, and then a couple are started by lightning. Most are accidental human ignition. Like what? Like somebody tossing some burning trash out the window of their car, or somebody leaving something plugged in their shed that sparks and starts a fire. Or in one case, a number of years ago, a gender reveal party's fireworks started the wildfire. Or a power line sparking started the wildfire. So people might say, well, that's not climate change, right? No, of course not. But here's the difference. Imagine if that piece of burning trash or that spark from the power line fell on, wet vegetation. What would happen? Not much. Then imagine it falls on dry, bone dry vegetation, surrounded by miles of more bone dry vegetation. What happens? Climate change is not changing the initiation of the fires, but once that fire starts, it's burning greater area and it's burning a lot faster than it used to. So it's more damaging. In the same way, climate change actually doesn't affect the frequency of hurricanes. The frequency of hurricanes is determined by natural variability. But once that hurricane forms, it's powered by warm ocean water. And you know that extra blanket I talked about that we're wrapping around the Earth? 90% of the heat being trapped by that extra blanket is going into the ocean. So there's huge amounts of extra heat in the ocean to power stronger hurricanes that ramp up overnight from a tropical storm to a category 3, 4, or even 5. We're also seeing that atmospheric rivers, which hit the coast of California, are much stronger and they're dumping way more rain because warmer air holds more water vapor. So the warmer the air, the more water vapor there is for any storm, whether it's a hurricane, a regular storm, or an atmospheric river, to sweep up and dump on us. This is what I'm talking about with climate change loading the weather dice against us. So this is exactly what we see. We see worsening fire seasons across California and the West and most of Canada as well. We see stronger atmospheric rivers hitting California and all the way up the coast as well. And people are starting to recognize that. A poll 2.5 years ago found that 74% of US adults agreed that they'd been personally affected by by hot weather. And actually 9 out of 10, 90% agreed they'd been affected by some type of extreme. And 2/3 of that connected it to climate change. So back in the 1980s, they began counting how many billion-dollar weather and climate disasters there were on average every year. And back in the 1980s, there was one about every 4 months. So 3 a year on average. Now, accounting for how the value of the dollar changes over time, of course, by the 2010s, there was one every 3 weeks. And now, as of last year, there was one every 10 days. This is global weirding. And why does it matter? It's obvious to you why this matters, right? I mean, the wildfire smoke affects our health, as does all the pollution from burning fossil fuels as well. This affects the water we drink, and we have not even seen what's going to be happening this year thanks to the drought. It affects the food that we eat, which not only needs water to grow, but also the more carbon dioxide there is in the air, the faster it grows and the less nutritional it is. And then all of the buildings and roads and infrastructure that we have, it was all built for a planet that doesn't exist anymore. It was built for conditions of the past. And remember, conditions are changing faster than any time in human history now. And of course, it impacts the nature that surrounds us. And this is important because not only is that nature incredibly beautiful, and not only are we as humans told that we have a responsibility to care for it in Genesis 1, but nature is what provides everything we have. Take a breath. Where did that come from? 70% of that oxygen came from the ocean, from phytoplankton and kelp. The rest of it came from plants and trees on land. Where does our water come from? All the food we eat, everything we use, it all comes from nature, not just on land, but in the ocean as well. So, I mean, just think about it for a second. Imagine if all of humanity disappeared off the face of the earth except for the rest of nature, not us. What would happen to nature? Nothing. It would be fine. Now, imagine if everything disappeared off the face of the earth except humans. We wouldn't survive. So caring about nature is not something that's sort of nice to do at the end of our priority list. It's something that's actually essential to our own well-being and that of every other living thing on this earth. People often talk about saving the planet, and I say, it isn't about saving the planet. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. We know that we cannot float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides. And I put a little asterisk on the us there because I want to be clear, it's all life, not just humans. It is about saving life. That's why we care. And I believe that if we take the Bible seriously, that we'll be at the front of the line demanding climate action because of what the Bible says about our own attitude towards life. Climate change affects us all. It affects the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, the infrastructure around us, everything that supports our lives. But it doesn't affect us all equally. So we know that as the world becomes more and more interconnected, that differences in terms of who emits more is shifting more from between countries, where certain countries are responsible for more than others, and the US is still number one there. But it's shifting more to between socioeconomic status. The richest 1% of people in the world, and the line for being the richest 1% is actually a lot lower than you would think. The richest 1% in the world produce double the emissions of the poorest 50%. Let that sink in. Often people say, oh, it's just overpopulation. I'm like, well, actually, no. It is inequitable use of resources. If 50% of people disappeared off the face of the earth, that would only reduce our impact on climate by 7%. And conversely, those of us who do live in high-income countries, it means that we have a disproportionate impact, not just through our personal choices, but through the choices that we can influence with our church, our place of business, our school, our city, and more. Why is this so unfair? Well, it's because even though rich countries and richer people are producing more of these heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, who's being most affected tends to be mostly low-income countries. On this figure here, I know the names are very small. I'll read them to you. But basically, the red is lowest income countries and the blue is highest income countries. And they are sorted in terms of who is most impacted by climate impacts. And at the very top, you have Malawi, Somalia, Eritrea, Mozambique, Niger, Tajikistan. Oh, there you have Australia. And then you have Chad, Sudan, Afghanistan, Madagascar, Liberia, and then you have the US. And the US, remember, we have $1 billion weather and climate disaster every 10 days in the US, yet the US is down the list. So this is an issue that is profoundly unfair. Those who've done the least to contribute to this problem are the ones bearing the brunt of the impacts. And this map makes that clear. It's true not just for country, though, it's also true within country. So recent studies in the last couple of years have shown, for example, that when we have an extreme heat wave, that low-income neighborhoods in the same city in the US can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than a high-income neighborhood with plenty of green space. So we see that climate change is indeed increasing the gap between the richest and poorest countries And this has already happened. The gap is already 25% bigger thanks to climate change between countries. But we also know, and this is an example from Oakland, we also know that lower income neighborhoods are at more risk from flooding, from pollution, and from extreme heat. And the biggest reason for that is lack of green space. Green space insulates from flood risk. It filters the air from pollution. It decreases people's inflammation markers in their blood, and it helps keep us cool. So this is such a challenging issue, and I think it speaks very much to what we believe, because it isn't only a challenge for every living thing on the planet, it is the biggest challenge for those who can do the least about it. Climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally, and that's not fair. So if we're worried about this issue, first of all, we're not alone. Second of all, we are responding in a rational way to exactly what's happening. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Worry is necessary, because if we weren't worried about something, we wouldn't want to fix it, right? If people think everything's okay, then you're not going to do anything about it. But worry is only productive if we know what to do. And it turns out, when it comes to climate change, most people do not know what to do. And that's why we end up in this situation. The majority of people are worried. 2/3 of people in the US are worried. 8% are activated. That's a very small number. And of the people who say they're not worried, I'm pretty sure at least half of them are. They're just lying to themselves as well as the poll. But making all the yellow people blue is not going to fix the problem, is it? What is our goal? Our goal is not to make the not worried people worried, because then you just have even more worried people who are paralyzed, but rather to help the worried people be activated. And this is where research is fascinating. In fact, this was a study that came out of Stanford 2 years ago. It had over 250 authors looking at research in 63 countries around the world. So this is not talking about just the US, it's talking about humans around the world. And what they found was very important. Because when people talk about climate change, what do you typically hear them saying? Let me take this off for a second. When you hear people talking about climate change, what are they talking about? They're talking about the polar bears starving and going extinct. They're talking about global sea level or global average temperature or ocean circulation slowing down. When was the last time you heard positive news about climate change? Unless you subscribe to my Talking Climate newsletter. That doesn't count. Anything else? When was the last time you heard positive information about climate change? Not often, right? So most of the news we hear is negative, and negative news gets the most shares and clicks online. A long time ago, in the news industry, in the journalism industry, the mantra was, if it bleeds, it leads. Do you remember that? That was basically saying if there's like bad headlines, then that goes at the top. Why? Because people would buy the newspaper. So the same thing goes today. If you share something online that is negative, people will share it. And so a lot of us have mistaken, people clicked and shared, for it's encouraging them to do something. And this is why social science, this is why behavioral science research is so important, because it is showing us here that that is not true. In fact, the study found that doom and gloom messaging, perfectly true. I'm not talking about making anything up. I'm talking about sharing perfectly true doom and gloom messaging. There's a lot of it out there, trust me. Sharing doom and gloom messaging was very effective at stimulating information sharing, like posting on the internet or social media where negativity reigns. But the researchers found doom and gloom messaging was the absolute worst for motivating action, and among the worst for changing climate change beliefs or support for climate change policies. In fact, negative emotions backfired. They made people significantly less likely to take action. Isn't this a little bit mind-blowing? So often we think people aren't worried, and we think if we make them worried, they'd do something about it. So we share negative information to make them worried. But it turns out that more negative emotion or more negative news, once we're already worried, doesn't make us act. It actually makes us less likely to act. That seems a little contradictory, but it sort of makes sense if you put the pieces together. And I'll put a few more pieces together here. Okay. So the way you think of it is this: climate changes and we get worried. So typically what we do most of the time is we load up our wheelbarrow of scary facts and we dump it on people. And those facts be totally true. I'm not talking about making anything up at all, totally true facts. But what the social science shows is that rather than being activated, we check out, and inaction results. One of the best books I ever read about this had nothing to do with climate change. It was a book by a neuroscientist named Tali Sharot. Her book is called The Influential Mind. And in it, she says something really important about how our brain works. She said, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. That's the way our brain is wired. Isn't that interesting? So the way we message about climate change, the way we communicate about climate change has been actually inducing the opposite of what we want. So this is another study. I promised you only one more scientific chart, and this is it. Let me explain what you're looking at, though, because it's not that hard. On the left-hand side, you have, am I willing to do something about climate change? And on the bottom, we have, do I think what I do will make a difference? And guess what? Most people are more willing to do something if they think it'll make a difference. Now, this isn't so shocking, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious. Who wants to do something if it's not going to make a difference? But let's connect the dots to climate change. So think about the terrible wildfire seasons that you've had in California. And we've had terrible ones in Canada the last 3 years as well. Do you think that you individually can stop those wildfires? No, right? I can't. You can't by yourself. So I look at these impacts and I think, well, I can't fix this myself. So what do I feel? I feel like what I do can't really make a difference. And the less I feel like what I do can make a difference, the less I'm actually willing to do anything about it. So let me give you two other examples. So I only travel in person, and as you know, I'm giving this talk virtually. I only travel in person when I can bundle enough events together to make the carbon and the time worthwhile. And so it takes a lot of work to do that. I plan very far ahead and I put a lot of effort into trying to be very, very frugal with my travel. And then I've been doing this for a number of years before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And then I read the headlines about thousands of empty flights being flown just to save their gate assignments. Thousands of empty airplanes. And I thought to myself, what is the point? I have been trying so hard to reduce my personal travel, and they're just flying thousands of empty airplanes around the world. It made me feel completely helpless. And then a year or two after that, after we started, giving presentations again or seeing people again in person, I was giving a presentation to a group in Virginia where my family, my in-laws are from. So I was there for family reasons, and I was also giving talks while I was there. And this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, for many years, I have lived a near zero waste life. She said, at the end of every year, you could put all the plastic waste I had generated in one sandwich baggie. And I was like, wow, that's very impressive. And she said, and then I had a heart attack. And thankfully, she is physically well now. But she said, I had a heart attack and I was taken to the hospital. And in one day, they wasted more plastic in one day than I had generated in 10 years. She left the hospital physically healed, but heartbroken because she had tried so hard and she had realized it was completely pointless. So, what's the lesson there? The lesson there is that all too often we are told, and then we tell other people, when we take action, the most important thing to do is to focus on our personal carbon footprint, on our personal choices, where we get our energy from, how we travel, what we eat, what waste we do or don't produce, what we buy or don't buy. And don't get me wrong, if we live in a high-income country, which we all do, then our choices do matter a lot more than if we lived in a low-income country. That's for sure. But we also know that we could do everything we could, and it won't be enough. And in fact, the harder you try, the more you realize that that's not what's going to fix it. So ironically, the harder people try to cut their personal carbon footprint, often the more discouraged they get. And what we're actually starting to see now is we are starting to see people actually go off the other end. We're starting to see people check out because they've been so worried for so long. They've tried so hard to reduce their personal carbon footprint, but they don't see any good news about climate solutions. They don't think anything's happened since the Paris Agreement was signed 10 years ago. They don't think any positive action is happening because they don't read about it in the news. They don't know that we've already cut our projected future climate change by end of century almost in half. They don't know that clean energy is like a giant boulder rolling down the hill in the right direction. They don't know that even though the current Trump administration has tried its best to stop clean energy in its tracks in the US, the best it's been able to do is to reduce the growth rate of clean energy by 17%. That is the most this administration has been able to do so far. And around the world, it's taking off. People don't know that last year and the year before, China installed more solar energy in 1 year than the US has in its entire history. And they did it again, a second year in a row. They don't know that China's clean energy exports are reducing global CO2 emissions by 1% every year. They don't know that 2 years ago, the country of Pakistan installed more solar energy than Canada has in its entire history, and they did it in 1 year. People don't know that climate solutions are all around us because we don't hear about it. So people are worried. They hear all the bad news. They do everything they can to cut their personal carbon footprint. Then they start to feel like it doesn't matter. And then you know what happens? They check out. They decide, well, there's nothing I can do that will make a difference anyways. So some people just literally check out and they're like, well, I'm not even going to talk about it or worry about it at all. And then other people decide, I'm just going to tell everybody we can't fix it. And even worse, some of them, like seriously, this actually happens to me on a very frequent basis, like at least once a week. Some of them even get on social media and they decide to attack climate scientists. And I'm not talking about people who disagree with the science. I'm talking about people who completely agree with all of the physical science, but they've decided that we can't fix it. And so they just want to attack people who say that there's something we can do about it. They want us all to give up. Well, I do know that if we do give up, we can't fix it. But I also know that we can't afford to give up because what's at stake is too big. It is literally the future of everyone, everything, and every place that we love. So if we're not going to give up, what do we need to know? This is what we need to know, that worry is good if you know what to do. And most people don't know what to do. Most people feel helpless and hopeless. So let's get into a little bit more here. And don't forget that you can be adding your questions. Remember, adding your questions on the phone? Let's see. We already have, I think we no, we do have a couple of questions. We have a few questions already. So don't forget, you can add your questions. You can upvote. I will be getting to your questions in a few more minutes. But let's go back here because there's more to share. So the real problems, though, is that we understand it's real and it's serious. Most of us do. The majority of people do. That's what I think of as the head. But what we're missing is the heart and the hands. What's the heart? Why does it matter to me? What's the hands? What I can do about it. Let me show you the evidence. The head-heart gap is something known as psychological distance. I think of things as being far away from me in time or space. And when it comes to climate change, this is exactly what we do. These are these maps I showed you before, and this is saying, first, do you think global warming is happening? You can see that most counties are orange, and in California, some of them are very dark orange. Do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? Where's the difference here? Well, these are non-human species. People are like, yeah, sure, plants and animals. What about people who live in the future? Yeah, definitely people who live in the future. What about people who live far away? Yeah, probably people who live far away. And then the researchers asked this question, what about you? Isn't this revealing? I mean, look at California. Excuse me, who has not been affected by a changing climate in California? Who has not been affected by wildfires, wildfire smoke, atmospheric rivers, massive amounts of drought, and much more? Who hasn't? Yet look at those counties. There's a few that are pale yellow. That's like just over 50%. Every single one of those counties should be purple. 100%. We haven't made the head to heart connection. And this is not, I don't mean to pick on the US. This is a human issue. This is the same figure I showed you before for the world, who's worried about climate change. And then they ask people, do you think it will harm future generations? And you can see that it's a bit lighter, but mostly it's still pinkish. And then, will it affect you? Isn't that crazy? So when we're talking about this, what's the first thing we have to do? We have to talk not just about the head, but about the heart. What's happening here and now in ways that matter to us. But there's a second ingredient too. The whole world could be worried, but if they don't know what to do, they'll do nothing. We have to talk about the hands. In the US, we know that most people, over 50% of people, feel helpless and hopeless and they don't know what to do. In fact, if you ask most people what they can do about climate change, the number one answer is recycle, which, don't get me wrong, recycling is a good thing to do. Reducing the waste in the first place is even better, but it's not a climate solution. So that's why the fourth thing we need to know is this. If you're worried, you're not alone. It's a rational response. Worry is good if we know what to do. And the last thing is we can't do this alone, but we absolutely can do it together. So how do we tackle the head to heart and the heart to hands gap? It turns out these maps have one last thing to tell us. So we left off the maps over here, right? Do you think it will affect you? This is the head to heart gap. There's one more map that is darker blue. What do you think it is? The darker blue map is, do you ever talk about it? Do you ever talk about it? And most people say no. And around the world, again, this is the are you worried? And then here is the do you talk about it? Look at that. Why does this matter? It matters because if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you do anything about it? Talking about it is like the domino at the front end of this long line of dominoes that will lead us to a better future. And yet we are not knocking over the first domino. Now, when I say talk about it, often people say a couple of things. Number one, they say, well, I'm not a scientist. That's okay. It turns out research has shown that scientists are pretty trusted messengers. It's true. But there's one category of people who are more trusted than scientists. You know who that is? People we know. Friends, family, colleagues, people we know are more trusted than scientists. So what does that mean? It means that you are a better climate messenger than I am to people you know. What's the next thing we need to know? It's not about the head, remember? You might be like, well, I don't know the latest facts about the polar bears. That's not what you have to talk about. What do you have to talk about? Heart and hands. What's the heart? The heart is how you're being affected, or your family's being affected, or the place where you live is being affected. Whatever you have in common with someone, that's the place to start the conversation. And what are the hands? The hands are what we can do to make a difference. That's what the hands are. So put those pieces together. heart and hands. All of us can talk about, wow, this was a terrible year for skiing. My family usually goes skiing, but there was no snow, so we couldn't go. And then it's going to be even worse because that's our water's pack for the next year. Or when there's wildfires, or when there's heat waves and your kids can't play outside. There's so much that we can do to connect the dots between what's happening and why it matters. And I personally believe that it has everything to do with what we believe, too. So if you look at what we believe that we are to care for God's creation. Let me share this again. Caring for God's creation and all the other living things that are already being affected by climate change today. I mean, in Genesis, it talks about how we're created in God's image to care for every living thing, including our sisters and our brothers. It is a faithful acceptance of our responsibility. And even more, isn't it an expression of God's love? Didn't Jesus tell his disciples that we are to be recognized by our love for others? Didn't the Apostle Paul write that the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love? And so when we look at acting today, aren't the actions that we can take about loving each other, loving God's creation? And I don't know if you watched the broadcast from the Artemis 2, but as it was just going around the other side of the moon and they were about to lose communication for a brief time, one of the astronauts reminded us all, and this is actually my newsletter this week, if you're interested, I have the quote, remind us all that love is the most important thing that we have. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. So when I was asked to address 10,000 evangelical leaders a year and a half ago at the Lausanne Congress, and if you're interested in watching my talk, you've got your phones, right? You can take a picture of the QR code there. It'll take you to my talk. It goes a little bit more into depth into the theology behind why this matters. So it's not the same talk that you just had today. This is a different talk that talks a lot more specifically about what the Bible says and how that relates to how what we believe relates to the biodiversity crisis, the pollution crisis, the climate crisis. And then after I gave that talk, I wrote an article for the Lausanne magazine called Loving Our Global Neighbor, which specifically talks about what churches can do. So if you're interested in that, take a picture of that QR code. And that's more about how can we actually take action together as the body of Christ specifically. But I also have one more for you. See, this is why you had to get your phones out. There's a lot of QR codes going on here. I also have a newsletter. Whoops, there we go. And the reason I make this newsletter every week is because this newsletter is my personal practice of hope, sharing what? Heart and hands. So every week I share good news about climate solutions. I share not so good news about how climate change is affecting not the polar bears, but us, like our health, our well-being, our food, our communities, our insurance rates, Japanese rice harvests, bananas, fertility rates. I share that information and then I share something concrete that we can do every single week because people are like, okay, well, I've already talked about everything you talked about in your TED Talk. And if you've read Saving Us, they might be like, well, I've already talked about everything in Saving Us. What more? Every single week I have more talking points. So there's no excuse not to have these conversations. Because to care about climate change, somebody doesn't have to be a scientist or an activist or even environmentalist. You just have to be a human being living on planet Earth. And when we look around, so many are already on board. Entire countries are on board with climate action. Cities around the world are on board. Yes, even here in Texas. States are on board, and California is definitely on board. California has been on board for a very long time. Companies are on board, making everything from net carbon negative carpet tile to net carbon negative shoes. Universities and colleges are on board, all across California and around the US and around the world. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and you can bet the Nature Conservancy is on board. Climate action is one of our 3 pillars. We want to protect the land and water on which all life depends. We want to help provide food and water for people in a sustainable manner. And we want to tackle climate change, including ensuring that we build clean energy in places where it makes sense and it doesn't put wildlife, biodiversity, or people at risk. Across California, we have amazing projects. If you're interested, we do everything from working on the kelp forest to managing wildfire risk to working on insurance for wildfire. All kinds of things. You'd be shocked at what the Nature Conservancy does these days. And yes, guess what? Christians are on board too. Many Christians are on board in the US and around the world. So we are not alone. Almost any type of organization you can imagine, including knitters, doctors, mothers, and hairdressers, are on board with climate action. And you know how they're all starting? They're all starting by talking about it. Climate action is not a giant boulder sitting at the top of a hill with only Greta Thunberg trying to push it up. Climate action already has millions of people's hands on it. That boulder is starting to roll down the hill in the right direction. And if you add your voice and if others add theirs, it will go faster. But what do we need to do to make it go faster? You know what you need to do. There's one thing, and that is to have a conversation about why it matters and what we, as a group, an organization, a church, again, where you work, where you live, where you go to school, where your kids go to school, who you play ultimate frisbee with, who you go kayaking with, who you walk your dog with, who you play hockey with. Have a conversation about how it affects what you both or all care about and about what you all can do together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe. And I think now you're going to go ahead and field our questions from the app. Is that correct? Is that how this works?
It is, exactly. And here we go. It's not too late if you want to do a little more upvoting, you can. You'll see things moving around as you go. What are particularly effective actions that you have seen church congregations do? That is a great question to start with. So first of all, there's no one action that everybody should do. The perfect action depends on who you are, what you're able to do, what your resources look like, and where you can have the greatest impact. On my website, which is just my name, katharineHayhoe.com, I actually have a whole section for churches. And then in that Lausanne article I shared with you, I have more information there. But there are many things we can do, and you are already doing one of them. One of them is starting the conversation. That's what you're doing right now. So having a conversation about it, incorporating it into a book study that you do, or a Bible study that you do. The Evangelical Environmental Network has a lot of resources on their website about Bible studies, having it in sermons. But then, what could your church do? Could your church put solar panels on the roof? Could it offer the roof to the local community as a solar garden? Because it's a lot cheaper to put a ton of panels on one big roof than it is to put smaller panels on a lot of smaller roofs. What about modeling behavior for people in terms of introducing people to here's what the electric bikes look like, or here's what the plug-in cars look like, or here's the way that we can measure our carbon footprint collectively as a body and reduce it in terms of our food and our energy and more. What about organizations who are taking climate action, like Tear Fund and Arasha and the Evangelical Environmental Network and even World Vision and Compassion International do a lot of climate resilience work in low-income countries that are most affected, which I know is the next question. And then what about the community? Who is vulnerable in your community? What can you do to actually work with them, not on the other side of the world, but right there in your community who are most impacted by heat, flood, drought, wildfire, or more? There's so many different circles of action that you can take, and it all begins. Every single one of these actions begins with something so simple we often don't think about it, having a conversation. How do people do anything if we don't talk to each other, right? So having a conversation about what we can do together is the number one way to do it. And just before the pandemic, actually, one of my last talks at a church in person was up in Toronto, where I'm from. You can tell there's a pattern. Whenever I visit family, I also give talks too. And I was giving a talk at a church just before Christmas. And I was standing beside the door, and one woman was walking out talking to her friend. And I heard her say to her friend, "I've always been worried about climate change, but I never knew what to do." And now that I found out that food waste is such a big problem, if food waste were its own country, it would be the fourth biggest emitter in the world. Wasting food, when it decays, it produces heat trapping gases too. She said, now that I know that food waste is such a problem, I'm going to eat the Christmas leftovers. That'll be the first thing I do. I was like, that's it. You just have to start. Start with something. And then before you know it, that church actually had a green team, which they never had before. And then the green team started doing things. So that's what you can do. Start somewhere, begin with the conversation, and see what you can do to make a difference. So the next question was, why are more global South countries more vulnerable? Well, it's because climate change is the hole in the bucket. If you think of poverty, lack of access to clean water, hunger, lack of access to basic health care, basic education, safe places to live, all of these are issues that are prevalent here, but they're much more prevalent in lower income countries. And when people in those situations who already don't have enough to eat, already don't have a safe place to live, already don't have clean water coming out of the tap or basic health care, when climate change comes along, they are much more vulnerable. So let me give you an example. Hurricane Matthew, a number of years ago, it hit the Carolinas, and there were about 30 deaths, and there was quite a lot of damages. But the same hurricane hit Haiti, which is the poorest country in the entire Americas. And it was devastating. It kicked off a cholera epidemic across the whole country that killed almost 100,000 people. The level of homes it destroyed, the level of crops it destroyed, the infrastructure destroyed was orders of magnitude beyond what we saw in the US. And their ability to recover was much less as well. So same hurricane, very different impacts. We see that too. So a number of years ago, I don't know if you remember, there's a very bad drought in Syria about 10 years ago that led to the Syrian refugee crisis. They estimate that as many as 90% of rural farmers had to abandon their farms due to lack of water and the fact that they weren't allowed to drill a well because you had to get a permit to drill a well, and that required money. And if you didn't have money to not just pay the permit, but to bribe the official, you couldn't dig the well. So at the same time, there was a drought of almost the same magnitude in Texas at the same time. There were about $8 to $10 billion worth of losses. And many people, many farmers and ranchers were devastated. They had to truck water in. Many of them have to sell off their herds. So there were impacts, but there were order of magnitude different impacts because the infrastructure was different. So that's why there's such a greater impact in low-income countries, is because they're already so vulnerable. It doesn't take much to push the system over the edge. All right, let's look. We have a couple. I'm going to do a speed round now for the last couple of minutes, if that's okay with you. All right, let me look back at the questions here. How are scientists able to determine Earth's heat levels going back 2,000 years? That is a great question. So we actually have thermometer records going back to the 1600s. But beyond that, we have what I call natural thermometers. So we have the date that the cherry trees have been blooming in Kyoto, Japan, going back to 812 AD. We have records from tree rings, because the width and the density of the tree ring tells you about precipitation and temperature. We have records of tree rings going back almost 10,000 years in some places, including the White Mountains. We have historical records of when the river froze or when a certain crop was harvested. And then we have ice core records, which are super cool. Ice cores have layers in them, just like tree rings. And in each of those layers, they have little bubbles of what the atmosphere was like when that layer was sealed off from the atmosphere. And in that bubble, you can measure the heat trapping gases, the dust, and you can measure an oxygen isotope that tells you what the temperature was at that time. So the ice core records go back almost 1 million years. And then in the ocean, we have sediment records with foraminifera layers. Foraminifera are tiny organisms that actually trap information in their shells about what the temperature of the ocean surface was when they were living. And then they fall to the bottom of the ocean and they build up in layers. And so you can go back hundreds of millions of years. And then beyond that, people can use rocks. So there's really cool ways to find out what's happened in the past. But the bottom line is, the more we learn about the past, the more worried we are about what's happening now, the more unusual it is. And the last question is one that I love. What would you suggest for students? So I teach myself, And the most important thing I have to say to anybody who wants to make a difference is who you are is unique. And this goes right back to the image of the body that I talked about at the beginning. You know, the church is a body. Somebody might be fingers. Somebody might be part of the skin. Somebody might be, you know, the liver, the brain cells, the eyes. We're all different and we all have something different to contribute. So if you're going to study whatever you love, that you're passionate about, that you're good at, and that'll be something different than somebody else. And then use your skill set to make a difference. So every day I work, my own degree is in atmospheric science, but every single day I work with people who have degrees in biology, economics, public policy, law, medicine, public relations, technical writing, journalism. Let's see, I know I'm forgetting more. Educators. Oh, I work with educators all the time, teachers, architects, other healthcare professionals. I work with people across the whole spectrum. So what you should be doing is a combination of what needs to be done, big circle, can't do it ourselves. We need everybody's hands pushing that boulder. What needs to be done, what you're good at. Don't waste time doing what you're not good at. Somebody else will do that. Do what you're good at. And then the last one is what gives you joy. God has given all of us unique abilities, unique interests, unique talents, and a unique background. And we know that we are each simply called to walk in the good works that God has prepared for us in advance. And those good works will look totally different from one person to the next. And all we need to know is the next step in front of us. So that's sort of the way that I have lived my life. It's taken me to a lot of interesting and different places I never would have expected. But each time I know that I'm doing what I do because climate change is profoundly unfair. It's affecting those who we are told are the least of these, who we are told to love and care for. And it is the responsibility God has given us to care for every living thing on this planet. So that's why I'm so glad to be able to speak with you today. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope that this has helped you think about how to start having conversations about what you can do too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe. And thank you all for coming today. We're so grateful for your participation and your presence, and do continue to participate with us throughout this creation season and the different events and programs we have running. And we wish you all well. Thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe, again. We are so grateful for your presence with us today. Take care.